In today's game, we see Bobby Fischer crushing a fake tactic. Wow, what is that all about? Well, this game has relevance for three reasons, not including the fake tactic. One, it was played in a United States championship, and any game Fischer played in a U.S. championship is historically important. Second, it is in Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games, although I think it may be the shortest game in that book. And third, it reveals how intimidating Bobby Fischer had become by 1963. Certainly, except for the very top Soviet players, everybody else, I think, was shaking in their boots when they sat down to play Bobby, and this game is evidence of that. He had the white pieces. His opponent is a player named Robert Steinmeier, who I must confess I don't know too much about, but he was in the U.S. Championship, so he could play. And Fischer has white. He begins with e4. And Steinmeier plays the Caro-Kann defense with c6. Just to get an example of why the Caro-Kann is played, if black plays, say, the French defense with e6, d4, d5, black is creating a strong point on d5, but the e6 pawn is blocking in this c8 bishop. The idea of the Caro-Kann is that after d4, d5, as was played in the game, black still gets the strong point, but the bishop is free to roam. The only downside is that this knight doesn't have its own natural developing square, but that's sort of the idea behind the Caro-Kann. Knight to c3 from Fischer to help defend e4. The pawn is taken, and knight takes e4. Now today, many players with the black pieces are playing this move knight to f6 after knight f6, ef6. This is sort of a topical position in the modern game, but the traditional main line has been this move, bishop to f5. Gaining a tempo against the knight, and again, developing this bishop that you were successfully able to not block out, and you want to develop it before the knight comes into d7, get it out before then. So the knight goes to g3 from Fischer, hitting the bishop, so gains a tempo, the bishop goes back to g6, and the main move, most common move here is h4, threatening h5. You want black to play h6 to sort of soften up this g6 square. Fischer plays a different move order, though. He plays knight to f3, just developing his pieces. The knight can go to e5 later, also harassing the bishop. Most common response is knight to d7 to contest that e5 square, but here black plays knight to f6, also a playable move, and then Fischer plays h4. With the same idea as we saw to play h5, so black would play h6, and then the knight at e5 harasses the bishop. Black does play h6, and the most common move here is knight to e5, threatening to take on g6 and damage the pawn structure and weaken the light squares. However, Fischer plays, maybe not the most precise, but as the game progresses, you'll see it won't matter too much, bishop to d3, immediately challenging that bishop. Black really has to exchange here. He can't allow white to take on g6 again and ruin the pawn structure, and to tuck it back at h7 and just lose a tempo doesn't make much sense. So Steinmeier goes ahead and takes on d3. Fischer recaptures with his queen, and e6. And in fairness, black has a completely equal position. You'll notice he really doesn't have any bad pieces. I mean, his rooks aren't developed yet, but both knights, this knight will come to d7. This bishop is a good bishop. It's not inhibited by his own pawns. Black has a good position here. Fischer plays bishop to d2. He could castle either direction, but he's going to castle queenside. Obviously, this pawn at h4 makes kingside castling a little less appetizing. Knight b to d7. In this Caro-Kann structure, black gets his counterplay usually with e5, which is rare because it's usually controlled, or c5, which is much more common. This c5 move is trying to liquidate white's central space advantage. The knight at d7 supports that move. Fischer goes ahead and castles long. And here, Steinmeier plays queen to c7. Again, this queen supports both of those moves. Also very common is the move bishop to e7 with the idea of castling short. This is a scary position for black because white can, after knight to e4, he can play g2, g4, and attack on the king side. As it turns out, black has a lot of defensive resources in this position and does play this position quite a bit. And it's, a game. But Steinmeier plays queen to c7, not only because he wants to prepare c5, but he also has another idea in mind. After c4, gaining space, helping control the d5 square, Steinmeier castles long. You can see what he's doing. The Caro-Kann is known as a sort of a safe opening. where black plays to have as few weaknesses and bad pieces as possible. And he's also castling on the same side as Bobby Fischer, so he's trying to keep the symmetry. You can see that, to me, this indicates a bit of an intimidation factor from Fischer. Steinmeier's playing a little scared at this point. Another idea, maybe a better one, is bishop to d6, with the idea of playing bishop to f4 and trading off the nice dark squared bishop of Bobby Fischer's. That might have been a slightly better idea. But he castles long, and black is still fine here. Now bishop to c3 from Bobby Fischer. Putting this bishop on a nice diagonal and really clamping down on this e5 square. So if black wants to break in the center with e5, it's just not going to be possible. What that means is really this c5 break is his only chance. And if Fischer at some point takes on c5, this bishop would be released on this nice long diagonal. But it is at this point that Steinmeier sees a tactical idea, what I'm calling kind of a fake tactic. In other words, it looks really good for you, but it doesn't work. It sort of bounces back on you, and Fischer sees the hole in the logic of black's play and exploits it very nicely. The move that Steinmeier sees is queen to f4 check, right? So the bishop moved from d2 to c3, so now there's a check on this diagonal from f4 to c1. Fischer plays king to b1, and here's the idea from black. Knight to c5. Looks like a strong idea, right? The knight attacks the queen, and if the pawn takes the knight, then black just takes the queen with the rook. So there's a pin on this d-pawn. And this knight is going to come into e4, and black is getting what looks to be some pretty nice activity, and at worst, he'll get to exchange off some of Fischer's powerful pieces. So this looks good right now. It looks like a strong tactical concept. But Fischer, with calm, just says, okay, just moves the queen back to c2, and now knight c to e4. So black is threatening to take on g3, maybe win a pawn there. He's putting some pressure on the f2 pawn, but black may have forgotten a very important strategic question, one that Fischer does not forget. And the question is this. When you're looking at a position strategically, one of the questions you want to ask yourself is, what is the weakest spot in my opponent's position? Where are they most vulnerable? Now, I'm going to clear the board here, and I'll ask you this as a test question. You can pause it for a second if you want. What is the weakest spot in black's position? And I'll give you a second. You can pause if you want. Okay, the weakest square in black's position is the f7 square. Notice it's not defended at all, and it's actually rather hard for black to defend that square. Fischer plays knight to e5, and the game is essentially over. Black doesn't resign here, but the game is over. White is totally winning after that move, and there's just nothing he can do about it. So what does he do here? He plays the move knight to f2. Now that looks like a reasonable response, right? He's doing the same thing. He's forking Fischer's rooks. The problem is this, rook d to f1, pinning that knight. And here, black resigned. Let's look at why, however, because at first it doesn't look like it's completely winning for white, but it is. When black plays queen takes knight, which he would have to play, Fischer can play rook takes f2. And the threats are absolutely overwhelming. Not only is Fischer threatening to take on f7 with the knight, forking these two rooks, but at the moment, both rook to f3 and rook to h3, either one, will trap black's queen. So there are two moves that are threatening to trap black's queen, as well as the knight to f7 check. The best thing black can do here is play bishop to d6, then rook to f3, traps the queen. You notice this square is controlled by the knight. This square also controlled by the knight. There's just nowhere for him to go. And here black could play bishop takes e5. And here, if Fischer takes the queen, bishop takes rook, black has a knight and a rook and a pawn in exchange for a queen. That's reasonable material, and it could still be a game. The problem is Fischer would not take the queen with the rook. Instead, pawn takes bishop. And now it's a double attack. Fischer attacks the queen with the rook, the pawn attacks the knight, and he's got to save the queen, and then, of course, he loses the knight after queen to g4. The queen isn't trapped now, at least, but Fischer just takes that knight. This bishop's power is just getting stronger and stronger. He's up an entire piece, and obviously we can see why black resigned. So an important historic game and a little lesson about make sure those tactics work before you play them. I hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.